Today's agenda looks like our introduction, where we do a recap and discuss the purpose of our flood task force. Next, we will have a funding strategies conversation and overview that will talk about the different funding types that are available to help ensure the success of the action plans that these teams have been working on so diligently. Then we'll transition into a presentation where HCMA is going to talk to us about the emergency flooding response, what they're currently doing and how that overlays and can be integrated into the action plans that we have for the flood task force. That will transition into a conversation about early severe weather warning system procedures. We'll then move forward to our action plan status and finally move into our next steps, where we'll discuss homework and close out. As many of you all know, the Governance and Coordination Action Team is umbrella under the full DC Flood Task Force. This Flood Task Force was established by the City Administrator September 23rd of 2001, and this was in direct response to the devastating flood that occurred in many of our DC neighborhoods and wards on September 10th of 2020. This task force reports to the Deputy Mayor for Operations and Infrastructure, also known as DEMWA, and it has two co-chairs, the CEO David Gaddis from DC Water and Director Tommy Wells from DOEE. We had our initial kickoff meeting November 17, 2021. And with all of our meetings, whether tasks or the full task force meeting or our action team meetings, these are proceedings that are open to the public. So the public is welcome to join all of the meetings, welcome to view our website where we hold all of our previous meeting recordings, any material that helps guide our conversations and our knowledge on moving forward. And that can be found on our website at dcfloodtaskforce.org. Again, dcfloodtaskforce.org. So again, we started November 17th, 2021, and we have had a robust schedule and have got a lot of work done since then. Our full task force team meets every other month on the third Wednesday, and our next full task force meeting will actually be next week, Wednesday, July 20th from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. Our action teams, much like we have this morning, are our residential resilience, which occur the second Tuesday every single month, and our governance and coordination team meets the second Friday every single month, or in the event that there is a holiday, we make sure to notify the teams via email and on the website when there are changes. Our full flood task force has a final report that is due November 2022, and from this, we will create an action plan for each of the 9 categories outlined by the city administrator. After November 2022, the task force will meet annually to continue to discuss budgetary requirements for action plan priorities. Again, we talked about the 2 action teams, and so on the slide, we have listed our residential resilience, which covers categories 1 through 4. They met this past Tuesday, and their next meeting will actually be Tuesday, August 9th at 2:30. And then again today, we're meeting with the governance and coordination team that covers categories 5 through 9. So with that being said, I'm going to transition our first discussion over to Barbara Mitchell from DC Water. Barbara?
Good morning. As Adria just said, my name is Barbara Mitchell, and I am an Assistant General Counsel at DC Water in the Department of Government and Legal Affairs. So today we're going to revisit the funding strategies that were first presented by Pew Charitable Trust a few weeks ago. As you may recall, Pew Charitable Trust presented this action team with strategies to fund many of the objectives of the flooding task force. Several of the funding strategies have been around for a long time and are well known to the members of this action team, while other strategies were newer and required a little bit more ironing out. So what you see on your screen is a summary of the 8 proposed approaches to funding. What we will do today is talk about the significant considerations that the task force must evaluate and weigh when pursuing funding strategies for our action plan. Now, each of you are subject matter experts in your field, and I'm sure we can talk for hours and hours about good approaches to funding or what matters concern us when it comes to funding strategies. However, we are quickly approaching the end of the flooding task force, and we really need to make some key decisions soon. While I'd love to hear what you think is the right direction on funding today, I can fully appreciate that you may need to conduct some additional research for yourself and to evaluate the options against the mission of the respective agencies you represent. To that end, today's conversation will center around the funding type, any significant considerations we should weigh, and whether you think all of the significant considerations have been captured here, or if you think they should be modified or removed. Today, we'd love to hear from you during the presentation, but I understand if you, like me, are on your first cup of coffee, you might not feel like weighing in too soon. But I do want to level set and just kind of let you know our expectations. So at a minimum, we'd like you to identify in the chat at the end of the presentation anywhere from 3 to 5 types of the funding strategies that seem the most prosperous by the end of the presentation. Don't worry, we will conduct a more formal survey in the coming months. So again, if you need to kind of discuss it with your team, if you want to kind of look at these funding strategies against your own mission, we totally understand that. So these top 3 to 5 funding types that you put in the chat won't be held against you, but should give us a little bit of a roadmap on what the group is looking at. I should note at the outset that I am not a funding strategist. I hope everyone can see my album. I am not a funding strategist. I have presented this to a lot of the funding folks that I trust and think have great ideas about funding and different, I guess, best practices when it comes to funding programs. But I am not a funding strategist. And I'm also not here in my capacity representing DC Water, in any legal form. I'm just here to support the action team, and I'm happy and eager to facilitate today's presentation. So I'm hoping that our conversation leads us to a path where we can finally work towards funding real solutions to the issues that the district faces related to flooding. With that, let's get started. And again, please don't feel shy about raising your hand, chiming in where you think there's a significant consideration that we should expand or revise. So let's move on to rainy days. All right. Our first funding type is an appropriation and rainy day fund. As you can see in the second column, I've listed the different reserves that were reported by the Office of the Chief Financial Officer in April of 2022. And you can see that these reserves are pretty robust, where the district has withstood a public health emergency. And so I think the district should be somewhat proud of what they've been able to maintain in these reserves. But something else we should consider is that these reserves have some legal requirements that must be met to access them. And you can also note that if the reserves are depleted, this can impact the district's bond rating. And I know many of you who are listening understand that the bond ratings are important to signify financial strength. We should also consider that flooding, while very important to this group of people, is not the only type of emergency that the district faces. We literally just, I wouldn't even say we're not even through it. I would say we're continuing to address the residual effects of the public health emergency that began in March of 2020. I'm going to pause here just to hear if there are there's any feedback on that, or if anybody wants to maybe chime in on that. I don't know if there's anything, but giving a second. Alan, nothing? Okay. All right, we can move on to bond. Okay, so when we're looking at bonds, the good thing about it is borrowing is a little bit inexpensive at this time. It was last year, and it has been for the first half of this year as well. The other issue with or I wouldn't say issue, but the other item that we should consider is that bonds are a type of funding that allow us to fund a wide range of infrastructure projects. So that's a very good way and good source or funding source to fund those infrastructure projects that we've discussed over time. We should also consider that there are debt limits that the district cannot exceed. And I know even for DC Water, the board has established our own debt limits. And so those things are considerations that we must weigh when we're looking at going through a bond as a funding source. Also, we've got to pay those back. So those things have to be paid back over time, and they can sometimes create some conflict of the projects that are currently slated to move forward. So those are some of the things that we consider when we're looking at bonds as a funding type. I'm going to just power through this, and if someone would like to give some feedback, I'm counting on you, Adria, to let me know to stop. We can go to public and private partnerships.
Yes, Barbara, I am watching the chat for you. So far, we don't have any questions, but we'll let you know if they come in.
Excellent, excellent. So I believe some of you I've seen in my former life in the council, and I know you're very well familiar with public and private partnerships. And those really work well when the private entity can take on financing of the project based on a promise of opportunity to realize return on investment. So these partnerships, again, work well when the private sector or technology and innovation can combine with the public sector's incentives to complete work on time and within budget. This is probably a good kind of source because it's a non-traditional approach to funding, again, and it can not really interfere with the ongoing funds that are committed to different CIP projects currently. Another key consideration is that there must be a clear and guaranteed income stream identified to attract private investments in P3 arrangements. So I know we've seen in the district in different funding types, whether that's wireless throughout the district or other opportunities, that there really has to be an opportunity for that private arm to get some money back there. And, most of them are looking to fulfill some of their shareholders' objectives. And so if we can't really identify that guaranteed income stream, there can be some complications with moving forward with the public-private partnership. Let's move on to TIF and PAYS. So TIF, I think we all know about, which is tax increment fund financing. But we also were apprised of PAYS from one of our members here, and that simply is a property assessed clean energy. So in this funding scheme, borrowing on a PACE model enables private residents to pay for flooding infrastructure projects at a lower rate. And it's been useful because folks sometimes need other mechanisms to help them pay for some significant changes to their homes. And so when we talk about getting homes flood ready, we certainly want private owners or private property owners to consider some of these really robust and helpful approaches to their own homes, but they've got to pay for it, and it has to be a reasonable way to pay for it. When we talk about TIFs, that's a large-scale approach to funding projects and also does not impact the ongoing funds committed to different CIPs. What we should consider when we're talking about PACE is that a private property owner is required to invest in the flood protection or mitigation projects. So they have to have some funding available to them. And really, the other piece is that the financing is secured via a lien on the property in most cases. I think I saw in Florida that there was some litigation against the jurisdiction because there was some concern that the property owners didn't fully understand what they were entering into. And so there was some concern about, best practices, consumer safety and things of that nature when it came to this model. Now, again, I don't think that means that PACE should be off the table. I think that we should maybe learn from our, these different jurisdictions who have tried to roll it out and see what they they have kind of had some missteps and where we might be able to fill those gaps, but it is something to consider. It is a little bit innovative, and maybe as far as financing, it might be a little bit of advance for some of the property owners, and we certainly don't want them to feel like they've been entering into some type of predatory practice. So we certainly want to be thoughtful when it comes to that type of funding structure. Additionally, with TIFs, this requires council action. And I also want to note that my limited understanding of TIFs, because I know I told you guys I am not a financial guru or strategist. My limited understanding is that from the development perspective, where there's significant improvements made within a TIF district, that building or that district will have a higher value, and therefore they can pay higher in property taxes, and that kind of creates the cycle there of the financing that we're looking for when it comes to, you know, a model of building something up. I'm not sure how this really works for our purposes, and I don't know if anyone has any feedback on that. If they want to maybe put it in the chat or discuss it later at the end, but if you're looking at that model in a different way and maybe a little bit more expansive, we'd love to hear from you, because I think it could be a great way to access a lot of funding. But I do think there's that kind of that anchor project that I'm missing, and how that might help. So we'll move on to environmental degradation tax, not degradation. So the good part about any tax is that it's a new source of income and revenue. And so that's great, and we love that. But what we should also consider is that an environmental degradation tax does follow the carbon tax model. So I know that can be exciting for some, not exciting for others, but it is a non-traditional approach to funding projects that do not impact ongoing funds that are committed to other projects. So that's always good. Another significant consideration is who really ends up paying these taxes. Is there a practical and legal possibility to share those taxes equitably throughout the tax base? I know, as you know, we're not a state, and even still, the federal government does a lot of times escape different fees and taxes and things, and there's some legal implications there. So we'd have to be thoughtful about how that might impact the tax base. We also know that there are a lot of taxes out there, and I'm sure folks are thinking, like, another tax, like who's going to pay for that? And I think that that's a reasonable question. We probably need to take stock of all the taxes that are being imposed, and then just kind of see if this is even a reasonable way to address some of the flooding mitigation strategies that we're looking to take on. Let's also move on to reforming infrastructure financing. So when we look at reforming infrastructure financing, I think that Pew is focusing in on infrastructure and making its more traditional funding mechanism available to blue and green infrastructure projects. Other significant considerations are that this type of new infrastructure approach probably needs a little bit more research, taking it on a larger scale. I know that we've had pockets. I know that DC Water has taken on some infrastructure projects that have some blue-green impacts there. And I believe DOEE is, if you haven't done it yet, you're absolutely looking into it. And I will let our DOEE counterpart speak to that. But I think taking it on as a larger scale approach, we probably need to think about how that would take place. Because the real thing that I think folks who have participated in green, blue infrastructure projects are probably thinking is that if you don't fund those projects and allow or allocate maintenance funding to it, you really are going to create some long-term problems. You know, this type of project really needs maintenance on a regular basis. And if we're not committed as the district to fund it continually, we really are creating a larger issue. We can move to the next slide. So next, we should consider the stormwater infrastructure fee. Again, we always love a new source of income because it hasn't been allocated and we can do with it what we will. But I think everyone on here who is a ratepayer is probably thinking, oh my goodness, another tax for residents? And you'd be right, because that's the only way to fund that type of funding type. So we should really consider whether that's the right approach. And to be honest with you, that's something that DC Water would have to do independent of this larger group, because we have our own board to kind of answer to. But nonetheless, it is a funding type that we thought we should bring to the group and just kind of highlight as one that is there. Our last funding type is philanthropy and grants. So of course we love philanthropy and grants because it's a new source, and there's a low risk, high benefit there, and there's no expectation to repay it. So that's always great. But another consideration that we have to kind of weigh is that we need to find someone who's interested in funding flooding infrastructure. And if they're not interested in investing in it, then we're kind of up the river, if you will, or up the creek. So not only do we need to identify someone who's interested, but we also have to appreciate that most times that type of funding source is really only going to be available for a limited time. And if that is the case, we will need to find some reoccurring dollars for maintenance. So that means even with the philanthropy and grants, we need to find and make sure that the district is committed to funding some of these things on a reoccurring basis if maintenance is required. So this concludes my formal presentation. And if we could actually, Adria, scroll up to the very first slide. I'd like to ask that participants for today look at the listing of the funding strategies. And if you wouldn't mind just informally placing in the chat your top 5 or 3 funding types, that'd be great. And if you want to reserve the opportunity to type it in, if you have any questions or concerns or want us to modify anything, I understand that too, and I'm happy to take some questions. Can we go to the first slide?
We are going to pull that up for you in just one moment.
Okay.
Our technology has not had its second cup of coffee just yet.
Understood. I need my first. So those should remind you of the ones I just spoke about and the considerations that we highlighted when it comes to flooding the objectives.
Barbara, thank you so much for putting this into a digestible format for all of us. I do have a question on the tax increment financing. I don't know what that means. So how is that different than a fee or a separate tax?
So it's interesting. So it's like I said, I'm not a financial guru, and if anyone wants to chime in, I'm happy to have them to do so.
I'm happy to chime in after you're done to talk about it.
Who was that?
Oh, this is Lily.
Lily, if you want to, I'm happy to send it up. The one thing that I would say, Meredith, is to think of it as where we are in Navy Yard. This wasn't here before. And so when the folks came over to the mayor's office and the council and said, we have this huge idea of putting Nats Park right here, and we want to, build all these amazing buildings, and we want to locate DDOT there. All of that was thought about way ahead of, the way it looks now. And because of this great improvement, we pay higher taxes in this area, and we basically put that money back into the coffers, and we're paying it on an increment, if you will. So we got the money up front, we're now have these beautiful buildings. We have to pay a higher tax. And so it goes into like kind of a cycle. That's my very basic explanation, but I'm happy to open it up to the other group.
Yeah, I feel like that was a good explanation, but yeah, it's a very popular development tool, and basically it funds developers ahead of time in, I guess, expectation that there will be an increase in property tax. So they kind of fund that increase ahead of time so the project can happen. And in a lot of municipalities, there's like a clause that it only goes towards development projects that would not have happened otherwise. And then I think the one thing I did want to point out is there is a lot of criticism about TIFs. It's very popular amongst a lot of cities, but it, I guess the criticism is that it tends to divert property tax revenue because it's the future property tax revenue. It diverts it from other municipal uses. So yeah, I like studied in Philly, and it was a lot of times diverted from school funding, for example. So something to note.
And Lily, I'm wondering, thank you, Melissa, for putting that in the chat. Lily, I'm wondering, do you see a nexus here? Because that's like what I was thinking. I'm like, I know it from the development perspective, but when Q presented it, I was wondering what would be that kind of anchor or that large funding source that could put the money up front. I couldn't fully understand what that was going to be.
So I'm not sure either, but from what I understand, it's usually through bonds. So it kind of goes towards the other thing that you mentioned.
Right.
And it looks like we have a comment from Sandra in the chat. It says, many of these options are not either or, but pairs and combos. For instance, P3 would be viable to an interested partner with a steady income stream, such as stormwater infrastructure fees.
I had a question. In the stormwater infrastructure fee, are you just referring to, can you provide a little bit more information on that? Is that the existing fee?
No. I didn't mean to cut you off. That was more of a call and response.
And I was letting you respond.
No. Well, I think you were going to say, is that different from what we have now? So it
Yeah.
actually, you know, we that current fee, I like that you know that. I don't know if you know that as a ratepayer, but I do love that you know that. That current fee is maintenance focused. We're looking at the infrastructure and building out and I guess fortifying what we already have, and using it for infrastructure. So that would be something completely different. And I would agree, my colleagues from DOEE would probably say resoundingly, please do not even think about touching the current stormwater fee, because that money really has to be allocated for what it currently is doing.
Yeah.
I see a little bit of a nod there.
There's a nod, but I'm going to say something a little out there. But as far as a tax, I know I've spoken to Meredith about this. Is there a reason why maybe even a bottle tax wasn't put on the list, or is that?
So that's what we're considering in environmental degradation tax. So
Okay.
With you on that, and here's what I really wanted to be able to do. I think we need to grab our colleagues in the OCFO and let them say, hey, here are the listing of all the taxes that we are placing on this entity, and you know, our just general tax base and our transient tax base. I think that would be helpful for us to understand, because what we don't want to do is double down. And I think what you're saying is exactly right. We should be looking at that, but we need to look at it in a comparative sense. So if that's something you're interested in, I think our next step is talking to OCFO and getting that full listing of all of the things that are being taxed currently, so we can figure out if there's a gap, if there's a way to make some changes to the law, if you will, and divert it differently. But we certainly need to kind of understand the breadth of the taxes that are currently being imposed.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, and a lot of it is the political will and the appetite to put these into place. So, you know, in the stormwater world, I know my colleagues at DOE certainly have tried on a lot of these things, especially the bottle fee, and it just hasn't gotten anywhere. So, but perhaps bringing up the flooding issue is, you know, it's an additional problem to add in there. Maybe that can be the thing that pushes it over the finish line.
Well, it might be worth distinguishing a tax that is citywide versus a tax that is applied, you know, only to those that are in the floodplain or only to those that are, yeah, like otherwise identified as having flood risk. They're kind of two different. Is that the distinction between the environmental degradation tax and infrastructure fee? Yeah. Yeah. And I guess
I
the
like,
other,
oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
no, I was gonna switch to the TIF, but if you have a comment on the tax part.
It sounds like the taxes, we have some legs on the tax, so I think we should, maybe that's like a note for us to look into bringing in Patricia and others from OCFO to figure out if that's something that we want to move forward on. But so I know you want to move to TIF, right?
Yeah, well, I was just thinking about, I mean, the TIF examples that I think most of us know about are to promote, you know, like building construction, and the idea being that once, you know, if you go from a parking lot to like 3 high rises, like there's going to be more tax revenue. So I'm trying to think about the shift here, because we're not talking about building buildings, we're talking about building green infrastructure. And while I would love, I'm let's say I'm well, I would love to say that building green infrastructure is also going to increase your property tax values. I don't think it's going to be of the level that you see from buildings. So there needs to be, I think, like a secondary component here, which is like, okay, if you're going to, we're not really capturing excess property tax values up front. What we're doing is it might be some kind of like environmental bond, which I know DC Water has kind of played with a little bit, where you're trying to like incentivize the performance of the infrastructure and off like the costs that you are offsetting because you don't have to pay for XYZ anymore because you have the infrastructure. So I know that probably wasn't the best explanation, but I'm just trying to make the distinction that the TIFs really work because you're building giant buildings that are bringing a lot of people in and you can get tax from it, but it's a little bit different when we're just talking about infrastructure projects.
So can I ask you a question? I want to not push back in a bad way, but just to kind of narrow us into a place. Is your thought that when a TIF comes before the council, that maybe there needs to be a thought about how this development will have a blue-green approach? And if you choose not to, then there's some type of funding that is supposed to be diverted towards that, or is that not what you mean?
Oh, well, so that's one way to think about it too. I mean, so what I heard you just say would be pick an area that is ready for development, ready for like buildings, right? And then as part of giving you this upfront money as a TIF, you have to build blue-green infrastructure. That's certainly one way out of this. I guess what I was kind of thinking of is if we have an already developed area and we're trying to get money to fund blue-green infrastructure and say, I don't know, West Branch or something, the math is not going to work out as well because like in a typical TIF, you're like, okay, we're going to take this 3-story building and now we're going to make it 10 stories and then do the same like for the rest down the block, and that's going to increase a lot of revenue, and that's what's going to pay us back.
Right.
But if all we're doing is just, you know, building a nicer park, I mean, sure, it'll increase property values a little bit, but it's not going to pay you back the cost of the, you know, 30 million or whatever that you put into it.
I agree.
Yeah, I'm just trying to make sure that the math has to work out in order for it to be a viable.
That's why I think that we may have to be in the future, because I don't know. And then if there is a fund that we create, or if with the actual development, if there's a requirement of blue-green infrastructure, like some component, then I think we have it built for us by the developer, right? Or we have a fund, or, you know, a certain amount of the money that I guess gets deducted. I'm, you know, of course, just very much talking off the top of my head.
Barbara,
That we could, oh, go ahead.
I did not mean to interrupt you, but I did want to let you know that our chat is getting pretty active.
Okay, I'm
And
sorry. Thank you.
there is Andrea Lemora, apologies if I mispronounce your last name, had some information here about the TIFs that I think might also be helpful to this conversation. They said, not an expert here, but my understanding is that there is a cap in the district about how much of our debt can accrue through TIF. And I think that that cap has been reached. The cap is set by law and can be changed by the council. Basically, if a TIF is an agreement between the city and developers who agree to pay future taxes on the development, not as a lump sum, but at a lower rate, we will get the money that we need now rather than at smaller annual increments, and the developer gets a deal on the rate. What Lily said was correct. In non-TIF circumstances, as taxes are paid annually, they get distributed around to fund different social services. When taxes are paid upfront to finance infrastructure, then there is no tax coming in from that development for X number of years
That's
to
right.
fund, for instance, a new neighborhood school.
That's right. I love that. That was that I feel like we started one place and we kept building, and she really like kind of took it home. So thank you so much for that. And the truth is, I think we have to confront is we are talking about we're not talking about something super exciting. We're talking about getting people's homes and this district flood ready. We're talking about the future. So I feel like what you said is very much direct. But we might want to just kind of we might want to first find out where we are on the TIF cap. That's a great point that she just made. But I think we also need to figure out if there is a little bit of room, if we can kind of grab onto it, only because I just don't know where we're going to, I don't know how we would be a part of this conversation otherwise, if that makes sense. We don't have enough money. There's nothing to anchor us or to bring about more funds or taxes at all. So I just think, I don't know if your comment is because you're concerned that TIF is not, maybe that's what I should ask. Is your concern, was the purpose of the comment to just explain it a little bit better, or do you have a concern with that mechanism altogether? I do want to kind of understand that first. And if you're able to come off mute, I'd love to hear from you, but if you like the chat, that's fine. I'm assuming she's typing.
Yes, she said was just explaining and just having some mic tech difficulties. So that's why Andrea is not coming off mic. But she said she just wanted to give a further explanation.
Excellent. Okay. Well,
can I just jump in real quick on TIF? I used to work. This is Alex Cross. I used to work at DemPed and worked on tax increment financing projects.
Where have you been, Alex? What
Sorry.
in the world? You hear me
No.
like talking about it? This is our financing guru. Go, Alex.
No. Just the only thing I want to state, I think it's a great idea to be trying to get this type of infrastructure in the conversation. And I think talking with OCFO would be a great start, as well as talking with DemPed. Just to remember, I think the district now, we utilize TIF as an economic development and housing production tool. So any more funds that go towards more expensive, more costly types of infrastructure will take away from the housing and the economic development, retail, and job creation. So it's just that balance there that we have to make sure that we know we're working with, right? Because the dollars are finite, And if take $1 away from housing to put the infrastructure, that's $1 away from housing. So just a thought to keep in mind as we move forward on proposing these types of strategies.
So Alex, you do know you've nominated yourself, right?
That's fine.
You
Yeah,
have
that's
nominated
fine.
yourself. Okay, so what I would like, just so that we can keep this conversation going, and I'm kind of going off cuff, so I hope my working group members aren't upset with me, but it would be lovely if you could put that in a little blurb, either in the chat or an email after, just so that we know exactly how we should be approaching this conversation. I think it's important that when we are talking to our colleagues, that we don't come to them and say, like, kind of blow up everything. Like, you know, if we're talking to DMPED or OCFO, they're like, excuse me, what? So I think what you said, what really strikes the right balance of, one, a mastery of what actually goes on with the TIF, but also where there might be one little small opportunity for us to kind of participate in it in a meaningful way, without just kind of scaring them off, and basically OCFO says good day and good night or DMPED. So if you don't mind, we love that, Alex.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
And then-
I would say the American Rescue Plan is in the grants piece. For sure. So we have to wait until those are available, and also, you know, have to get that funding, and hopefully we get it at the appropriate rate as a state.
Yeah, so I want to add that, so Barbara, we were talking about doing a little more investigation on these ideas and then bring them to the task force in September
Okay.
to get some of the directors' feedback.
Yep. I
Yeah,
was
so-
remarks, I was saying, you know, we can all have these preliminary conversations, but really you want to kind of talk about these funding ideas and match them against your mission, get that feedback from your director. It really is a very delicate balance and dance. So I totally appreciate that as well. And so if we do that in September, maybe then we can have a more formal surveying of the group. But I really am actually very pleasantly surprised about the feedback, because watching the Pew presentation, I didn't know if people were just like, this is not for me. This was really good, guys.
Well, thank you
Thank
so
you. This
much,
has been a big help.
Barbara. Yeah, thanks for leading this discussion. Thank you everyone for your participation and thoughts. And again, it does not end here, and will be brought back up in September. So with that being said, we will move forward with our discussion on emergency flood response. We have a representative from FEMA, Andrew Worrell, who will be leading us through this conversation.
Hey, good morning, all. I'm gonna try to make this as engaging as Barbara's conversation was about taxation and incremental taxation efforts to support flood response. But Adria, if you would advance to the next slide, what we'll do is I'm gonna try to walk the group through what we currently have as our emergency flood response timeline. One of the things I'd like to do is orient to the group with the image on the right. That image on the right is the current EOP construct for phase-based response. Phase 1, activate; phase 2, operate; and phase 3 is actually the demobilization process. The slides that we have, or the information that we're displaying here, largely align to phases 1 and 2. The actions on the left and the owning agency functions on the right are based on an overview of response operations. And in this case, it's detailed specifically for flood. So that begins with an incident or event assessment. And much of that is based on the advisories, watches, or warnings that we receive from the lead federal agency for meteorological forecasting, and that's the National Weather Service. I believe the follow-up slide session, we will talk about some of those, the advisories, watches, and warnings, and the overlay of multiple systems that we have to provide emergency alert. The alert notifications are those are those products that allow us to prepare. And that's oftentimes difficult with a flood. Tuesday was a very good example of what early alert system notification looked like. The National Weather Service and DCH SEMA began to send out flood warning informations at about 6:51 in the morning and advanced all the way through. In some cases, some of the jurisdictions fell under a flash flood warning. So that only happens, or any of the pre-event planning and coordination only occurs if we all receive from the National Weather Service sufficient prep time for warnings. In other cases, like a hurricane, that allows us for more robust preventative measures, such as levee installations, dry or wet waterproofing. As I move down, the red box shows where response phase 2 operations really begins to occur. This is also where if we have a no notice incident, such as just an issuance of a flash flood warning with no advance notification, and the district receives 2 to 3 inches of water or rainfall in 1 hour, and we have something similar to September 10th, 2020, this is where we would engage. And this, and I have a colleague, Wes Leary, that's going to talk about specifically one of the coordination calls. But this is a series starting from the most strategic down to the most tactical of the coordination calls that HSEMA engages in. And Wes, do you want to jump in here and talk about the Chief Operations Officer Senior Emergency Management call?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Andy. So we call it the CUSIM call. I don't know if anybody's from this group has been on it, but usually it takes place in preparation of activation. So the CUSIM call stands for the Chief Operations Office Senior Emergency Management call, and that's run by our operations division here at HSEMA, and it usually has about like maybe 100 different agencies from either district agencies and federal organization and federal agencies on the call, and it's ran by their emergency managers. And the CUSIM call, actually, we ask those representatives for their posture, priority, and their unmet needs in preparation to an activation. And it really helps with the agency coordination and preparation to an activation. And those calls lead into the CMT calls, which is the Consequent Management Team's call, and that helps them determine what needs to happen before an activation. So the CUSIM call is important, and it's one of the calls that we utilize for every activation or every incident prior to setting up. Thanks, Andy.
Excellent. And one of the things that CUSIM call and the Consequence Management Team call sets us up for is the next point of information, which is incident event planning and response operations. You'll see that this indicates missions and services. This is part of the district's emergency operations plans transition into missions and service-based response. And an example is we're currently working with DC Water can we go one slide back, please? An example is that we're currently working with DC Water as part of a working group to develop their individual service plans. And that is the water infrastructure service plan, as well as the sewer infrastructure service plan. Using them as an example, we're working with Dusty Lowndes, Greg Vernon, Adam Barron, and Alexandra Lampson to develop that in conjunction with the Army Corps of Engineers. And what that's designed to do is probably the sewer infrastructure is going to be a service that may be called upon when that mission is activated in response to a flooding event. The reference above to the incident management team, that's specific to the DC Water incident management team. So missions and services is the construct for which public safety agencies are going to deliver their service all the way up through emergency response. And we'll see in the next slide, but we won't transition there. We'll show you what that means and give a few examples. Rescue operations, for example, is tactical rescue that's conducted by FIMS. We've seen during the September 10th, 2020 incident that FIMS uses rubber ducky boats to actually go out and rescue stranded motorists that have gotten stalled out in high waters. Another, as we progress through the emergency flood response timeline, so to speak, is the damage assessment. And that's where we're conducting perhaps a post-emergency canvassing operations or an immediate needs call. And then as we progress even further, if this is a sustained response, if there's going to be enduring damages or enduring response operations required, we will then conduct an incident or event reevaluation for that sustained response. That's where they're reassessing the priorities and objectives and determining those required services, which may change throughout the duration of a particular event. Let me pause here. Any questions for Wes and I? Excellent. Let's move to the next slide, please. The next slide just briefly shows an overview of how a flood incident might matriculate. The National Weather Service notifies the entire NCR that an adverse weather event is expected. They issue advisories, watches, and then warnings in that subsequent succession to let the entire national capital region know that there may be incoming adverse weather. Based on that incident or event assessment, FEMA will conduct those coordination calls and try to determine to the best extent available the impact, scale, scope, and duration of this event. We and National Weather Service will continue to coordinate and send out alert notifications to the residents of the District of Columbia. Anybody that signs up for Ready DC or Alert DC, HCMA then conducts those interagency coordination calls. And then we have that concurrent incident and event planning based on the operational reality of the flooding situation. Again, pre-incident, is highly dependent upon how much advance notification we get of a disaster. Pre-event planning or pre-incident notification, to the best extent possible, allows us to arrange those emergency management assistance compacts, memorandums of understanding, mutual aid agreement, stage assets, and resourcings. But sometimes we simply don't get sufficient advance notification for adverse weather. And again, we go to those immediate response operations that are conducted by the agencies having jurisdiction. What that means is FIMS is not waiting for anybody to tell them to go out and provide life safety. They're going to go and respond in response to reported 911 calls and dispatch to, in this case, we'll use the example of the stranded motorists. Now, they may have to rely on other departments and agencies to actually access those impacted area, which DPW for debris management, DDOT for traffic management, and ingress and egress to the situation, deployment of those duck boats, things of that nature. Life safety, incident stabilization, and property preservation are the three key pillars of emergency management. And then you have that continual ongoing incident and event reevaluation. Again, you may have additional impacts or additional services or missions that are required based on the impacts of the event.
We had a quick question in the chat from Sandra. It says, in addition to DC Water for flood incidents, operations of levee structure is NPS. Are they part of incident team?
Absolutely. In fact, the National Park Service, the Army Corps of Engineers, HCMA, DGS, DC Water, Joint Base Anacostia Bowling. They are part of and would be called upon as part of that interagency coordination if sufficient advance notification is provided in order to establish one of two types of levees. That is the post and beam barrier as well as sandbag operations.
Andrew, can I jump in and ask a question?
Absolutely, please.
Thank you. Great presentation. Great information. I understand you can only react based on information you have in advance. The question I have is ongoing changes, and I'm particularly talking about change in stream levels, Watts Branch, Oxon Hill, that could flood neighborhoods. You don't know how much rain is going to fall or where it's going to fall. But if you monitor that levels coming up, what's a real-time communication look like?
I believe that, well, for riverine flooding, the National Weather Service, as well as I thought DOEE had a component that actually monitors the flood gauges. In addition to the Readiness and Response Coordination Bureau at HCEMA, they have they still issue those rises in. I think that's referred to as riverine or fluvial flooding. And that's where they access those the stream sensors.
So those alerts go out on DC alert also? That
They're
it's coming to flood stage?
They're received via the National Weather Service, but they can be monitored real time as part of the ESRI ArcGIS dashboard that we have inside the EOC. I think they use an API scrubber in order to add that information from the National Weather Service's website.
Mm-hmm. So I get on my cell phone alerts from USGS directly. When the level sensor hits a certain point, you can set it. But the question I had was, how would we communicate that to a resident who's in danger of being flooded in the city?
That's a great point. There was a discussion recently about modifications to what our current practices are. You know, one of the things that we can't do is overstate or restate something that comes from the National Weather Service. Also, they don't necessarily wait for our permission before they release something. Like if there's something that that meets their or exceeds their reporting threshold, they're sending it, particularly an emergency alert, service broadcast. But there was discussions about adapting the current triggering thresholds for adaptive alert DC messaging. And I think that Carolyn, when she returns from the ESRI ArcGIS conference, where this technology might be included, that might be an option that they can take a look at developing.
Thank you.
And also, I just wanted to plug DC Water. Great coordination with Dusty and her team.
Absolutely.
Let's any other questions?
You might be planning to address this, but I think the emergency response is fabulous. HCEMA, all the agencies, FEMS especially does fantastic job. I think from the task force perspective, what we wanted to look at is, are there any gaps, that things that haven't been addressed to a level of detail that they need to be addressed, and especially from the agencies that are involved in emergency response, or also on the planning side. What should we be doing on the planning side that maybe we haven't done to the level of detail that needs to be done? So I'll just put that out for the group. I think that's what we want to use the task force to accomplish here.
Sure, and very great, that's a perfect point, Meredith. One of the things that is reemphasized is that we can always improve. One of the things is we're transitioning to this new missions and services construct. I also would like to plug that missions and services construct is highlighted in FEMA's Comprehensive Planning Guide 101, the most latest revision, they actually did a spotlight on our transition to that. But we have a tabletop exercise coming up as part of this quarter's training and exercise program, and it is focusing on flood and response plans. Who has them? What do they look like? We've got a couple in our cache, but guess, there's never any finality on them. We've got one from 2016. We have a draft from 2019, but so that's what they're going to look at. A lot of discussion as well as to who owns the installation of levees and sandbags. We know the National Park Service, they practice that annually, the installation of the beam and post barrier. For sandbags, we know it's a coordinated effort. That includes purchasing the right type of sand, getting it here, getting bags, getting an actual sandbag machine. So that's part of that training and exercise is going to be to start to identify those gaps and challenges, and in particular, how fast they would be able to respond. As I understood it, the September 10th incident was almost essentially a no-notice incident. They did not anticipate that it was going to be as bad as it was.
Yeah, that's great to hear about the exercise. And yes, it is also the case that many, maybe almost all of our flooding incidents now are no notice incidents.
Right. Much of our planning team, at least our senior leadership, actually deployed to Ellicott City. And so they have brought some of those real-time operational experiences back. And one of the challenges with flooding, apart from a hurricane, is that in many cases, you don't have that gradual progression. Tuesday of this week was a great case sample of what right looked like. We had that progression throughout the day. You don't always get that though.
So maybe one suggestion is, I know that exercise I think is scheduled for September, but maybe we can put in the action plan, in the flood task force action plan, that we will use the results of that exercise to make any updates. And I think DOE is really encouraging, I forget his name, might be Rick, who's organizing we're encouraging to focus on the events where you can't plan. Because I think it's pretty clear that, like if we have 3 days warning, the levees go up and the sandbags, and that's fine. But I think the ones that we certainly want to have a better idea of is like, all right, we know there's going to be rain, but it could just be like, a quarter inch, or it could be like 6 inches in 1 hour. We don't know where. So I think that's where we want to focus on. But I think we can use, let's say in the action plan, we'll use the results of that and make any fixes.
Perfect. Yes. Rick Christ is a master exercise practitioner. He works with Patrick Morey, which is part of our planning, training, and exercise team. I work with them as part of the planning person. They conduct the training and exercise. And we can do that.
That's great. Thanks.
DOE. Just had a additional comment to make about just responding to Meredith's request to sort of identify any gaps. So I work at DOE and help implement the NFIP requirements as a floodplain manager. And one of those requirements is that we conduct substantial damage assessments. It was back in 2020, right after the September 20th flood event, where HCMA, rounded a bunch of, agencies together to kind of do an after action, assessment of, our performance. And there were discussions about the damage assessment process. And through those discussions, it was sort of identified that the district, just doesn't currently have a, standard operating procedure for executing this substantial damage assessments, which is which again is one of those NFIP requirements. And if the requirements aren't met, that does impact our ability to get those federal dollars, those federal disaster assistance dollars, because you have to be compliant with the program. And so with that being said, we have been talking with DCRA, which is one of the key stakeholders for executing substantial damage. Also, Rick Christ, I've made the, that I've made that requirement clear, but I just wanted to take the opportunity in the context of this DC Flood Task Force conversation, where ACEMA is sort of leading that, so you have the damage assessments, which I know you guys are more than familiar with, but then there is also this other substantial damage assessment requirement. And sometimes they get the substantial damage assessment gets lost in the conversation with damage assessments, because they sound alike. And so in my experience, someone will think that, oh yeah, we covered that because we just had that conversation about damage assessments, but in actuality it has not been planned out, and there's no exercise for it. So I wanted to highlight that.
I think I have a good news story to that. And what I mean by that is there's two distinctive missions. Damage assessment is actually one of the missions that HCEMA is developing. And that mission is comprised of agency services. There is a cost recovery mission, and that would be run by, or at least oversight provided by Charles Madden. Charles Madden would facilitate access to individual assistance or public assistance funds, as well as help prepare. I believe it was Russell who actually was part of the assessment team to see if we qualified based on they had to exceed a certain amount. But I think that Charles would be invaluable to weigh in on that, because essentially for COVID-19, he and I believe Melissa Diaz are on this, is also on this call. They worked in coordination as part of the overall district-wide cost recovery team. So I think that we do.
Right. So that is helpful.
Yes, sir.
Also, I just want to add, just thinking about this operationally, how damage assessments and substantial damage assessments need to go, or ideally would go hand in hand as recommended by FEMA. So case in point, if you're out doing the damage assessments, you are in areas where you're collecting the same information that can be used for the substantial damage assessments by DOEE. And so ideally what would happen is the three agencies, DCRA, HCEMA, DOEE, would have an understanding of what information is collected during the damage assessment process. And if there are some additional bits of information that can be included on those checklist items, that would be there to transfer or to share with DOEE for it to complete the substantial damage assessment process, so that there aren't two sets of teams going out to do the damage assessments, and then 2 days later, one team going out to do the damage assessment, and then 2 days later, another team having to go out and do the substantial damage assessments. Because as I said, a lot of the information is similar. And so it just takes some coordination, some identification of the information, and then coordinating how that information is going to be collected and then shared.
Victor, I couldn't have said it better. That was actually really good. It's my hope that with your knowledge, mine, Vermicia's, and the rest of this team, that we can ensure that those entities come together to have those discussions, because that was spot on. Also, we have the Flood Insurance Administration Service Plan that I need to send to you. I don't want to use that for this opportunity, but I think it talks about DOEE being the purveyor of the National Flood Insurance Program for the district. And it's a bit unique because there's no direct response operations, but it might assist in capturing those pre-incident preparation and then post-incident mitigation and resiliency actions that the National Flood Insurance Program is supposed to assist with.
Thank you.
Excellent. Let's talk about let's talk about some of these emergency alert systems and the redundancies as well as the umbrella of alerting systems that the district benefits from. Oh, I should have mentioned that this was just a general overview of an entire concept of operations. This is just an infographic that describes some of those pre-event activities on the left under the activate phase. As you move to the right, you go to phase 2, operate, which would really be the start of a no-notice incident. And you moved from top to bottom with those first response command control coordination calls, missions and services, public messaging, the public messaging piece. And then 2B, you get into the sustained response where you're continuing to do many of the things for initial response. However, for a particularly bad event, that's when you start to get into perhaps mass care and sheltering, evacuation operations, additional search and rescue measures, critical infrastructure restoration. And then phase 3, the demobilize, a lot of that speaks to what Victor and I were just talking about, which was cost recovery, performing the post-emergency canvassing operation, completing the damage assessments, and then transitioning that cost recovery for submittal or reimbursement. Let's move to the next slide. All right, early severe weather warning systems. Yes, here we go. One of the things that the district benefits from is an upside down layer cake, so to speak, an umbrella of protection. What I mean by that is you may not know, but the district's Joint All Hazards Operations Center has the FEMA Office of National Capital Region and Coordination watch standards. So they expand our watch coverage out to the surrounding states for Region 3. So that's one form of perhaps an alert warning system. Then we move to the NCR Watch Desk, which is another regional asset, which expands the district's watch capability out to the surrounding 23 NCR jurisdictions. So they're reporting on that. And then when you get into the district jurisdiction, you have the Jayhawk operators, and they're the ones that are working with the National Weather Service, Chris Strong, to actually release those alerts to the district residents and visitors. And that is an overview of the Alert DC system. The Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments provides us with the Regional Integrated Communication and Coordination System. That's the RIC system via Everbridge that allows us to draft up and release those alert messages. Those alert messages have the capability now to be tailored. Like we were with Salil, we were talking about tailoring perhaps even new or emerging concepts, such as when those flood meters start to rise from USGS, perhaps that's something that we can integrate. And those messages can be developed and tailored in the future. As we move down the wireless emergency alert systems, this is part of the nation's integrated public alert and warning system. This is the part of that system that DCHCMA owns and maintains. And what I mean by that is we have the ability, based on the scale scope or presumed impacts of an incident, we can push a message to a polygon or a particular area in the district, and it will force that message onto a cell phone, a mobile device, even if the member hasn't registered for those alerts, in a very similar capacity as the emergency alert system. So the WIA is just the branch of the Integrated Public Alert Warning System that HCEMA operates on behalf of the district. The emergency alert system, that is those are the ones that we receive through the FCC and NOAA, where they're pushing those alerts to all telecommunications systems and broadcasting services, smartphones, television systems. Those are the emergency alert systems or an emergency alert broadcast. The other thing that we have is the NOAA weather radio. There's a few systems that we have, radio systems within the Jayhawk, such as the National Alert and Warning System, as well as the Washington Area Warning Alert System. So there's two. There's one that covers the nation, and then there's one that is specific to the District of Columbia, and that integrates all federal and government-owned agencies operating within the District of Columbia. So that's one that spans not just DC agencies, but also the federal entities operating within the District of Columbia. FBI SIOC, HHS SOC, FBI's Washington Field Office, the Pentagon, President's Operations Center. So these are just the existing warning systems that the district has. Any questions about that? I know we're at 11:50 right now.
I don't see any questions in the chat, but I will keep you updated if they come through.
Perfect. Thank you, Adria. And then this is just that summary. HCEMA's 24/7 District Watch Center disseminates those alert DC notifications. And then for severe weather, particularly for floods, the National Weather Service notifies HCEMA, as well as all of the region. They are the lead federal agency for meteorological forecasting. We receive that information, we determine the key information that must be shared out, and then we release that information to the impact groups via Everbridge. And the Everbridge system is the RICS. If you ever hear somebody talk about RICS messaging, that's the Everbridge, Regional Integrated Communication and Coordination System. And those notifications are also shared with the NCR vis-a-vis the National Capital Region's Watch Desk. All right.
Hey, I just have one or more follow-up questions. So I know HCEMA is working on a separate action plan for some localized sensors systems at specific intersections with DDOT. And I think we've had some discussions within some of the task force members about, where else those could be deployed. And even just technologies, are there other local sensor technologies maybe already in place, or ones that could be put in place that could provide us with some immediate warnings? And Sandra put a comment earlier about, if there were some sensors at intersections that prone to flooding, that when the signal shows that it's flooding, if it's sent through electronic monitoring, then we would know right away that a particular area is flooding. So is that something are there people already looking at that, working on that, or is that something that we should kind of direct some people to work on? Is that an area of opportunity?
Absolutely. I think I know Wes has joined the call, so I think that he can speak to the installation of those flash barriers, and that is a recommended action. You know, I'm not necessarily an expert on flooding, but with part of our studies, we understand there's coastal, there's river, and then there's interior. And those are, you know, the fluvial, pluvial, and then surge flooding as a result of either high tide and a hurricane, excessive rainfall down upstream of the Potomac and perhaps the Anacostia. And then, of course, you have the man-made, which is the pluvial or interior flooding that occurs in districts' low-lying areas, and it doesn't have there's not sufficient capability either through natural water, you know, seepage into the ground, or through sewage. I think that there's always an opportunity to improve, particularly as the district continues to develop its infrastructure and develop its commercial and residential real estate.
Yeah, thank you. And just to respond to Sandra's question, the cost of the sensors is not necessarily low cost. So, but there will be a presentation from HCMA at next week's task force meeting on the current initiative to install some of the sensors at intersection locations.
All right. Hopefully, I made that as exciting as the previous discussion. And if not, and if there's any other questions that you may have, please do not hesitate to reach out to myself vis-a-vis, you know, Vermecia or even Melissa Diaz. I'm happy to help where I can.
Thank you so much, Andrew. There's one comment that just came in. I believe Ellicott City has installed flood sensors in their high-risk areas. Could be a good model to look at. Thank you, Victor, for that information. And again, thank you, Andrew, and everyone from HCMA for your insight and sharing this information. All right, so we have a few minutes left in our action team, and we're going to briefly go through our action plan status and connect with you all. So Nick from DOEE will lead us forward.
Thanks, Adria. All right, so next week on Wednesday, we'll have a full task force meeting. And just as a heads up of what will be happening there, all of the action plans that you see here will come up for a vote. And what a vote means is that if everybody votes to approve, if all the agencies vote to approve, then these action plans will be released for a 1-month public comment period where, you know, residents and the public and other stakeholders can actually make comments on these action plans. So it's, you know, it's not quite final approval, but it's, you know, it's the task force saying they're supporting these action plans and then, you know, getting feedback. And if there are any changes that we need to make as a result of the public feedback, we will ask the task force for kind of like a reapproval at the September meeting. So that's for these 5. You'll notice that we crossed out one of them because one of our action plans was to pass the Flood Resilience Act, which actually just passed at the end of June as one of the city council's actions. So that one's already done. I guess we can pat ourselves on the back for that. All right, so that's at the July 20th meeting, what we're presenting, or, okay, we switched to the next slide. So that was the vote. And then, so also at the Wednesday meeting, we will be presenting to the full task force for the first time these action plans, and we've highlighted in blue the ones that are coming from this action team, the governance action team. So, yeah, on here, you know, just so folks are aware, you know, we're expecting presentations from DEMWA, DCRA, and HCMA. Hopefully that's not a surprise to anyone. And right, so the way these will work is we will present at the July 20th meeting. After that meeting, it will, you know, we will make these, we'll make links available to all of these for agencies to comment on. So it won't be public comment for these. It'll just be agency comment for about a month, and then we'll make any changes. And then in the September meeting, it'll be vote to approve. All right. So I know we've only got a couple minutes here, so I'm just gonna use these next slides as kind of like a placeholder. I think the next time we meet as an action team, we'll need to spend probably about 20 minutes or something just looking through the rest of the action plans that we have on our list, on that spreadsheet. You might remember a spreadsheet we came up with a while back. Reviewing what we haven't decided on, but for now we can see, like we know for sure we want to present 6.6 in September. We've also greenlit 3 other ones. And I guess the idea is that we'll present those in September. If you go to the next slide, there are a few action plans that we need to decide if we're ready to give them a green light. We're not going to do that right now, but just kind of a heads up that these are the ones that we're, the next time we meet, we'll try and make a thumbs up or thumbs down on. And then I think there's one more slide. And then I think we can say right now that I think there are 2 that we're proposing to red light, but we'll want to get concurrence from this action team next time. But these are things that we think are just a little too far in the future for us to create an action plan at this time. So that's just a little preview of where what we'll talk about at the next action team meeting. But just to enter into the closeout section here for homework. Right, so for those of you who have action plans to present, it's prepping those action plans for Wednesday. And then, there's a few that we know we're definitely working on, and you'll need to draft those so you can present those in September. And then the last one here is make sure your voting member, that whoever from your agency, either the director or whoever they designated, will either attend, or if they can't attend, send us an email with what your vote will be on that first batch of plans. And so I sent out an email maybe 2 days ago with this information, how we're proposing to do the votes. But just a heads up, if let your director or voting member know that when they attend the meeting on the 20th, they will be asked to vote and put their vote into the chat. And so if they need to think about what they're going to vote, then now's the time to do it. And then, yeah, so next steps. Right, so we've got the next task force meeting, and I think just at the bottom here, the potential topics for next action team meeting, local workforce, and then, like I mentioned, really going through all of the remaining actions that we haven't greenlit and deciding what we're going to do with them. So that's it. Our last slide is just the upcoming meetings. We've got the July 20th, and then a month from now, August 12th, will be the next governance meeting. So pass it back to you, Adria.
Thank you. Well, if there aren't any more questions or comments, give it just a second. All right, then, well, the time is 12:02 and this meeting has ended. Thank you everyone for your participation. We look forward to seeing you next Wednesday at the full task force meeting, and have a great rest of your Friday.
Thanks all.
Thank you all.